From your world news headquarters on the World Wide Web, it's time for your daily dose of sanity. This is the Meria Heller Show. Meria Heller is a published author, founder of the Universal Wheel, a lifestyle and philosophy based on our interconnectedness to all living things, a Reiki master, and delivers the news with spiritual views. How many intuitive news decoders, animal rights activists, and vegetarian broadcasters are there? Just one, Meria. Meria has provided independent news for a smart audience for over 13 years now on the Meria Heller Show, available at Meria.net. Meria.net. And now, here is your host, the mouth that roars, Meria Heller.
Good morning, world. Meria here, alive and kicking. How's everybody doing out there? Welcome to the show. Wherever you happen to be listening, iTunes, YouTube, here on site, or anywhere else. Feel free to come over to my website, Meria, Meria.net, and check out the shows you haven't heard this week. Well, I hope you had a hearty breakfast, and I hope your breakfast didn't consist of any Hostess white donuts. And today you're going to get just a little more information on just what is in our food that we don't know about. We're very fortunate to have a special guest back on the show. She's been on the show before. She's fabulous. Her name is Brita Belli. She's the editor of E! Magazine. She's also the author of The Autism Puzzle, Connecting the Dots Between Environmental Toxins and Rising Autism Rates. So I'm very happy to have Brita back with me on the show. Good morning.
Thanks. Good morning.
Always a pleasure. I'd like to say it's pleasurable reading what you write, but it is educational, that's for sure. I got your issue, I think it's your December issue of E! Magazine, and the article on eating nano, which is pretty scary. We talk a lot about GMOs in the news, people trying to get their food labeled with GMOs all these years later, like 2 decades later, genetically engineered food. And then I tripped across the article on nano in our food and in a lot of products that we use. And can you explain, Brita, what is nano? What are nanoparticles?
So nanoparticles are just extremely tiny forms of, some things we'd otherwise recognize. They are tens of thousands of times smaller than the width of a human hair. And in the case of our food supply, they are being added to enhance coloring, to prolong the freshness of foods. It's being used in packaging to help prevent spoilage. It's being used in some cases to deliver nutrients. So these are just extremely microscopic particles, and because of their small size, they're capable of, acting in different ways in the body. In some ways sometimes that can be helpful, and in other cases, researchers are beginning to find out that they may be going places and doing things that we don't want them to in the body. So this is the concern with these particles.
Right. So are nanoparticles part of genetically engineering food?
I mean, they're really two separate issues, but there's a lot of similarities in terms of this, whole right to know kind of movement that's forming around them. The genetically modified foods has, been going on for some time. As you said, it's been, it's really been out there. It's a topic that people are kind of familiar with, and there's a lot of momentum behind. With nanoparticles, they've really entered the food supply very quietly, and probably about a decade ago. And just very little information out there about which products contain them. The health research is just really in its initial stages in terms of, what impacts these might have. It's really been kind of snuck in under the radar, and so there's really not as much kind of publicity about it. There's not as much understanding about them, and that's one of the biggest problems. But there certainly is some movement among some nonprofit organizations for better information about which products contain these nanoparticles, and a labeling initiative similar to the GMOs.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that most people just assume that all these things have been tested by our government alphabet agencies before they release them to the public. But your article makes it pretty clear that there's been very little testing on this.
Right. So what the Food and Drug Administration decided when it came to nanoparticles, and I should probably give some examples of what these are. So there's nano silver, nano copper, nano titanium dioxide, nano styrene. There's various. Many of them are metals, but other additives as well. And the Food and Drug Administration decided that these are essentially the same as their larger scale counterparts. So they don't need any additional testing. They fall under a provision known as the Generally Recognized as Safe provision. And that means that manufacturers don't even have to disclose these ingredients on labels. It also means that the Food and Drug Administration does not actually track which food products contain nanoparticles. And when I asked them if they could at least give me an idea of where in foods these are most often found, they couldn't do that either, because they said, well, we don't track it, so we can't reliably answer that. So there's just really a lot of uncertainty, and any of the information coming out about where these can be found is really coming from outside sources. It's coming from various scientific research. It's coming from consumer advocacy groups and the like. So it's just, I think it is kind of shocking that we don't even have really good information about to what extent we're exposed to these particles.
Mm-hmm. Years ago I had interviewed a gentleman who basically was working over in Europe, and at the time they were working on using nanoparticles in medicine as well. Of course, he thought it was a great idea. But for me, I was like, well, I don't know. I mean, nobody even knows what these things are, let alone start putting them into, your medicines as well.
Well, the supplement aisle is one of the places where you'll most often find this listed on the label. And so one of the benefits of nanoparticles is that they're more bioavailable to the body. The body can better absorb these because of their small size. They can get directly to the organs where they're needed. They can better deliver nutrients. So there's a lot of research looking at how can we utilize nanoparticles to get people kind of the nutrients that their body needs and that they're not getting as much of. We add a lot of nutrients to various cereals and things and vitamins, but we're not really getting the full benefit of those. So there's definitely some good research looking at ways that we can use these to our benefit. I mean, there's absolutely the potential health benefits to these. But with these other, but in many cases they're being added to products for things like to prevent spoilage, nano silver and other things like that. And it's, and it's known that these particles can get into the bloodstream, accumulate in organs. They can bypass the blood-brain barrier. So with these other particles that aren't being given for a very specific, nutritional reason, they're not being, or for a medical reason, they're just accumulating in our bodies without our knowledge, and we don't really know what the long-term impacts are. So that's where it's really a concern.
Right. So I guess when people talk about heavy metals in their system, this could be part of that.
Right, a lot, as with so many things, as with, our chemical exposures, it's really about, what are the long-term effects, what are the cumulative effects of these different things that we're ingesting, and don't we at least have the right to know what's in the food products that we're eating?
Well, I have to tell you, you have a little list, and I'm sure it's a very little list compared to how many there really are out there in the article with foods containing nano titanium. And I looked through it, and I was like, wow, I know these are some of the snacks I grew up with. Obviously, they're going to be different today because the composition is different. But it was kind of scary, And, a couple of months back, somebody told me Mentos, the mints, actually have some form of meat in them, so they're not something vegetarians can eat. But when I looked on the list, you have Mentos with nano titanium.
Right. So that was, one study that looked at foods containing nanotitanium. It's really nanotitanium dioxide, and it's being added to foods for white pigment. It's also added to paints and to plastics. It's added to almost all toothpastes. So it's another way that we kind of inadvertently ingest nanotitanium. But so they listed these products kind of from most to least in terms of what they contain, and it's a lot of these white sweetened products, a lot of candy, the Good and Plenty candy, and M&M's candy, and then things that have frosting, the Pop-Tarts with the frosting, all the way down to the Coffee Mate creamer. So it's really just being added for pigmentation, and the researchers kind of deduce that it's likely that children are ingesting this to the highest degree because they're the ones that are eating the most of these kind of frosted products and candy and sweets.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's another really area of concern is that these things are accumulating in the body. We know that they're capable of doing that. We're not really sure what the long-term impacts could be, although there's some initial research shows some unsettling findings. And then we have children that are getting the highest doses of these particles. So definitely some cause for concern.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, children today have so many grown-up diseases that people are, kind of questioning, how is this possible that children are having, diseases that you never saw before in anybody under 40 or 50? And, as an expert on autism, would you say that this, too, could be part of the epidemic in autism?
I didn't specifically see any research relating the nanoparticles to, rise in autism rates. But, again, this nanoparticle research is really very, very new. And it's, I think so all we really have right now are kind of a handful of studies that tell us, what may potentially happen when we ingest these. There was one that I cited in the article that had to do with chickens, where they tested these nanostyrene particles, and they found that depending on whether it was acute exposure or chronic exposure, it would either block the absorption of iron in these chickens, or it would cause them to absorb too much iron. So it showed that nanoparticles can have can cause very subtle changes in an animal.
Mm-hmm.
And the researcher said to me, we can't say for sure this is what happens to humans as well, but it just points to how much we need to research this to find out, okay, what happens with acute exposure, what happens with chronic exposure, and how is it, what are the more subtle effects that it might be having in the body?
Right. Well, your article also mentions that you can find nanoparticles in cosmetics. I think the last time we spoke, we talked about the fact that some nanos are also in some of the clothing we wear and some of the household items we buy.
Right, so these are very often used as like antimicrobial agents, and so they're just in a huge amount of consumer products for that reason. They're in socks and a lot of athletic gear. You find them in refrigerators, the microban in your refrigerator. So they're used in many, many products for this antimicrobial benefit that they provide. And, this, of course, poses not only an issue when it comes to our health, but it also poses an environmental concern because the tiny size of these particles means that when, we wash our clothes or things end up leaching from landfills, and these particles get out into the environment and end up in our waterways, they bypass wastewater treatment plants. I mean, although there are methods that we could capture them, those methods are not in place right now. So they're getting out to the wider environment and posing potential hazards there as well. So that's a whole other side of the story. But this is what happens when we have this added to our clothes and to all these products.
Right. Well, we're washing the clothes, so it only makes sense it's going to end up in the wastewater.
Exactly.
But when you talk about the size of these nanoparticles, how could they possibly strain them out from everything else, all the other filth that happens to end up in our wastewater?
I just know that I was on another program where there was an expert on nanotechnology who was saying that the technology absolutely exists to filter these out. He didn't feel that there was enough of an issue at this time where there was enough of a concern in order to start implementing these measures, but he said that absolutely there's technology that exists to do it. Again, I feel like there's just so much unknown about these particles that we're almost starting from scratch because we don't even have a comprehensive list. If we don't know what products they're in, how do we know to what extent they're getting out? How do we know the extent of our exposure? So there's just so many questions, I think, about these particles at this point, and yet enough evidence from some of the health studies that have been done that they could pose potential real hazards. there was another study that was done on carbon nanotubes, and because of the shape of some of these nanoparticles, so these tubes could get lodged in the lungs, similar to asbestos. And so that's kind of some early studies that have been done showing that, that these could be cancer-causing in some instances. Now, that would be of particular worry for people working in manufacturing who are manufacturing, say, computer parts, where these carbon nanotubes are found in electronics. But they have to use take particular safety measures to avoid inhalation. But, again, how does this affect us in using these products on a day-to-day basis? How does it affect the environment when these end up in landfills? So, I think there's just, again, we know there's enough potential hazards to really require greater regulation than we've seen. Absolutely.
Talk about unanswered questions. When I was reading your article, and you mentioned it briefly, a few minutes ago, when you wrote to the FDA and asked them about the prevalence of nanos in our food, their answer was the FDA doesn't maintain a list of food products that contain nanomaterials, so we can't reliably answer the question. Here we are assuming the FDA is looking out for us and finding out that they don't even keep a list of it.
That's right, and I think the other side of that coin is not only do they not keep a list, but it's also not required manufacturers to put it on their labels. It's a voluntary thing. So not long ago, the FDA released, this past year, released a sort of draft guidance because there's been a bit of, concern around this issue. They released this draft guidance to manufacturers that essentially just said, if you feel like these nanoparticles are changing your product in any way, you may want to put it on your label, but it's up to you, essentially. So, it's really leaving it kind of very vague and very voluntary. So, that's where we're at. And right now, there's only one group that I know of that's really trying to keep a comprehensive list, and it's the Woodrow Wilson Center, International Center for Scholars. And they've got this nanotechnology kind of group there, and they're this database that they're trying to create with listing all different types of products, including food. Unfortunately, the food section of their product list is just really incomplete at this point. So that's a good place that's a good starting point, and I'm sure they're going to continue to grow that database. And they've even created an app called Find Nano. So I think that's a good starting place for people, and at least to begin to get that information.
Right.
And then there's the study that you mentioned where we listed, every single one of these products that has the Nano Titanium. At least that was in the study, and that's available on our website, emagazine.com, if people want to see that. But we really need that as a starting place. Where are these? Where can they be found? How can I avoid them if I don't know where they are?
Well, when your article, I had to read it twice. It kind of caught me by surprise when it referred to white food. I said to myself, what's white food? So I had to pay more attention. But I think that's a good place for people to start. Anything that it really does use the color white, as you said a little earlier, frosted things, everybody's favorite little powdered Hostess donuts. Now I know why people gag on when they take their first bite from all the dry. I used to think it was just from the dry sugar. But, Good and Plenty, when I was a kid, I loved Good and Plenty. I was reading this list and I was like, wow, I'm glad I'm not a kid today.
Right.
But you also talk about caramelized sugar. Anything that has caramelized sugar in it could also have carbon nanoparticles in it.
That's right. And unfortunately, when it comes to that, the study, where that was found, they didn't list specific products. So again, it's like this big kind of question mark. So breads and cornflakes are kind of two of the more popular products that you might find with this caramelized sugar in it. That's one of those things about checking labels, and I think it's worth saying, as with the white pigmented foods, it's worth saying that when you turn around a food label and you see a lot of kind of unidentifiable ingredients, and a lot of additives and preservatives and colorings, those are things worth avoiding in your diet where possible anyway. So,
right.
Certainly that's something to consider. I think one of the things that's probably more concerning, like, at least for people that already are choosing organic foods and the like, is really the food packaging, because that's an area where, even organic companies could be suspect. I mean, we really don't know who has these in their food packaging, the nano silver, for instance, and to what extent it's migrating into the food supply. And that, is really up to food manufacturers at this point to begin to go back into their supply chains and find out these answers so that they can, either choose to not have these in their packaging or at least disclose that it's in there. But it really is on them at this point, since the Food and Drug Administration has kind of taken a hands-off approach.
All right. So even though it might not be in the actual food, it could very well be in the wrapper or the box that it comes into, which I would think would seep just like BPA does from a plastic bottle into your water.
Exactly, right. So that's the concern, and I know that some of the experts that I spoke to, like at NRDC and elsewhere, said that absolutely from these wrappers you can, the nano aluminum, the nano silver, can migrate into the food itself, and they know that this is possible. And again, we're dealing with this thing, something of such minuscule size.
Right.
It makes it very easy for it to travel.
Well, Brita, about a year and a half ago, I started working out with a personal trainer, okay? And he said to me, nutrition's the important part. At that time, I thought I was eating pretty healthy because I've been an organic vegetarian for 13 years. But one thing that he stressed for me was not to eat any packaged food, period, end of sentence. He didn't even want me eating a packaged protein bar. And, I thought about that when I was reading this article. And when people ask me, what's a good way to be healthy, not only do I tell them, to go try an organic vegan diet, but one of the things I tell them is don't eat anything that comes in a package. But I didn't realize, I thought all the other poisons were in there, but I didn't even think about nanos in it or in the packaging itself. So, what do we tell people? People listening to the show, they're saying, okay, we're going to look for white food, anything with white pigment in it, not eat it. Do you think that caution is required, eating anything in a package?
Well, I think, absolutely trying to reduce your intake of packaged food is a good idea for a healthy diet in any case. Again, this goes back to like what I was saying about the additives and preservatives. These are things, when you see a lot of these in the colorings, these are things that aren't great for the body. So when possible, I've heard it said before, when you go grocery shopping, try to shop on the outside of the grocery store and avoid all the interior aisles, so that you're really sticking with the fresh foods. That's, absolutely when possible, to what extent it's possible. It's great to try to limit the intake of packaged food just because, snacks, potato chips are organic, doesn't mean that they're healthy. Just because cookies are low fat doesn't mean that they're healthy. So I think, that's always good advice. And maybe this is really just one more reason, to begin to start to cut some of that stuff out of people's diet. Just an additional reason.
Exactly. I know for me, I just park on the side of the supermarket where the fruits and vegetables are so I can go in and go out. And then I was surprised one day I had some extra time, so I started strolling the aisles. And I was kind of surprised that they had an entire gluten-free section, which I told one of my friends about. And I said I didn't even know they had it because I usually skip all those aisles. So, it really, people have to understand too, the seductive nature of how supermarkets are set up to catch your eye.
Sure.
One of my friends just recently told me, it was only a day or two ago, that she got some product, I forget which food product, but she loves it because it says it's natural,
Right.
It says it's all natural. So when they say, enriched, okay, this product is enriched, do you think they're talking to nanoparticles being in the food?
Not necessarily, no. A lot of these, some of these uses, at least in that sort of form, are still being kind of in test mode still. We have a sidebar to this piece. We talk about vitamin delivery and how they're trying. There's research underway right now where they're trying to find a low-cost way to make these particles using natural ingredients so that they can be better added to food products, so that we can see things like omega-3 fatty acids and vitamins A, D, and E better added to foods or added to foods in a way that makes them better available to the body. But that research is still underway. So as I said, we see them in supplements right now, and in the food colorings, and then a lot largely in the food packaging as well. And so, as you know, that kind of to prevent spoilage, and those seem to be the primary kind of uses in the food supply right now.
Right.
But lots of research is underway to see how these can be used. I mean, there's some pretty sci-fi things out there that I read about, that in terms of, where we can almost personalize our food. I want my, food product to be this flavor and somebody else wants that flavor, and nanoparticles could make that possible in the future, that we really have this sort of customizable food. I mean, there's a lot of kind of futuristic things happening potentially in the food supply that don't sound very appealing to me, but
right.
But to food manufacturers, I mean, it's a whole new world out there.
That's for sure, and not necessarily a better one. One rule of thumb, I remember, years ago people said it, and they probably still say it. If you read a label and you can't pronounce what's in it, don't eat it. So that might be a little shortcut. If some of the words on some of these labels in the stores, they must have like 25 letters in them, and nobody knows what they are. So it really is a good idea to check labels where labels are available, I would think.
Absolutely. And I mean, I have seen, for instance, titanium dioxide listed. Now that I'm looking for it, I'll look on the back, and it doesn't say nano, but it does say titanium dioxide, and you'll see it on the back of toothpaste. You'll see it on the back of gum. I know I've seen it. So, that at least I've seen listed occasionally. And it's funny, maybe they just choose not to put that nano term on there. Probably not, so they don't want to scare people away. But as you said, I mean, if you're seeing a lot of unpronounceable ingredients and things, and, a lot of these additives, preservatives, colorings, these are really food products to steer clear of where possible.
Mm-hmm. Now, it also said that this is also in some household products like paint. Okay. So I'm like, oh boy, does that mean white paint is going to have nanoparticles in it?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's just so many applications for these. I mean, it's really incredible. They're able to make put almost anything into nano form at this point. And it's just added to a whole host of products, serving various functions. So, I mean, it's really, so we see it in technology, we see it in medicine, we see it in consumer goods. It's literally everywhere at this point. So it's really one of these issues where the science has really gotten ahead of the regulation, and they're really playing catch up at the federal level. And I think it's going to take really research finding definitively that there is, without a doubt, serious health consequences in order for anything to sort of happen.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Brita, we're going to take a short break. When we get back, I'd like to look at the business of nanoparticles. Obviously, somebody's making a whole lot of money on this, so stay with us. Brita Belli and I will be right back. Hi, it's Meria. I know you're sitting back there probably with your mind blown from what you've already heard today. And it's wonderful to know that you're actually interested enough in learning the truth about what's going on in the world. I come from a long line of truth tellers in my family, and that's all my goal is doing this show. No political affiliation, no religious affiliation, no hogwash, just straight truth coupled with my own vision and interpretation, should we say, deciphering of the news. Commercial free, no one tells me what I can and cannot say or who I can or cannot have on my show. Not backed by any big corporations, Ford Foundation, gold companies, just backed by your caring subscription. So if you're listening and you're not subscribed, why not? Get over to Meria, MERIA.net, and pick a subscription of your choice. It'll cost you pennies of cents a day to access over 800 hours of total education, uninterrupted, with the best minds on the planet. Again, that's Meria, MERIA.net. And now, let's get back to the show. Okay, I'm back. I'm speaking with the editor of E! Magazine. There's a live link right here to emagazine.com. Check it out. I think it's one of the best magazines, especially the best environmental magazines out there. I've had many of their authors on the show through the years of doing my show, and it's always useful information. So welcome back, Brita. Before the break, the other side of this, so far what I understand is the manufacturers and the people that are using nanos in their food are allowed to self-regulate or decide whether or not they choose to label it. And what kind of money are we talking about in the market for nanomaterials as far as just food packaging?
So, according to one report, the market for nanomaterials in food packaging is expected to reach $20 billion by 2020. And as a whole, the nanotech industry is expected to reach $1 trillion by 2015. And that's when you're taking into account all uses of nanotechnology right now, which is it's just really an exploding industry and phenomenon. And really, again, it holds so much potential, especially when you look at its use in medicine, for instance. They're looking at ways to deliver cancer drugs using gold nanoparticles and kind of target tumors with these, because of their small size, they can be really used to sort of deliver drugs in a very targeted fashion. So we are seeing, as you can imagine, there's just a huge amount of research money being poured into this industry to try to speed this up. So many potential benefits. And then comes the other side, which is, okay, well, what are the potential downsides? What don't we know about them? So we know that they can travel throughout the body, delivering drugs where needed. This could be just an amazing thing for treatment purposes. But what happens when we've got nanoparticles that aren't being, delivered in a targeted fashion, that aren't being given to us for a specific reason, but are just inadvertently ending up in our body, and how are those causing potential havoc?
Right. Well, that's the $million question. Then I was reading about something called Nano Clay, which is used by beverage companies. And I'm trying to remember, I think one state just recently outlawed plastic containers of all kinds in their state. And I can't remember which state it was, but I think I have it somewhere in my notes. So are you saying they're also using nanos, say, in soda bottles, things like that?
So in soda bottles to prevent, gases leaking out of the bottles. Nano aluminum is being used to improve aluminum foil to prevent sticking. Nano silver being used in food containers. So, there's just so many uses of this in kind of in a packaging form, and these are the uses of the nanoparticles that I think are kind of biggest concern, because these are not intended to be eaten, or ingested. These are only meant to prevent things from spoiling and from going bad, and allowing them to sit on our shelves longer. But they could have unintended consequences because they are ending up in our food supply, kind of against our knowledge. And there's actually another way that these nanoparticles inadvertently end up in our food supply, which is actually through our agricultural fields. Because they bypass wastewater treatment, they end up in the biosolids at the end of this treatment process, which are then applied to fields. And there was a study done that found that these nanoparticles that were likely coming from sunscreens and other personal care products were, in fact, in all parts of the soybean plants that they studied. So they know that those soybean plants will then end up in the food supply. They don't know to what extent. To what extent are we ingesting these through soybeans and through other crops, simply because they're being applied to fields. So they just have such an ability, these particles, to migrate and travel beyond their intended purposes. And I think that's where it doesn't seem as though there's enough regulation in place to prevent this sort of wide-scale exposure that seems to be happening.
Oh, exactly. Well, it would be nice for consumers to actually know what's in their food. I was pleasantly surprised, since I'm always slamming McDonald's and their fast food, to see that McDonald's was pretty much against using nano-engineered material in their food or their toys or their packaging. That was the shock.
Right. Well, what had happened was that that Woodrow Wilson Center, that's making that database of products and has that Find Nano app, had at one point mistakenly included McDonald's milkshake as containing nanoparticles in their database. So McDonald's, I think, felt the need to sort of come out with a very strong statement that they have nothing to do with this, because of course it got picked up, elsewhere and word traveled. So, but yes, they actually have like an actual disclaimer saying that they, for now, are not using this technology, are interested, but steering clear of it. And a lot of other food giants and food companies are taking the same cautious approach, apparently. Kraft Foods and Whole Foods, and several groups were interviewed about their use of this technology, and they're all kind of taking a cautious approach because they don't really know what the consumer backlash might be, what health studies might emerge. So the real question for them at this point has to do with the packaging. Many of them do not know whether nanomaterials are being used in their food packaging or not, because the companies that are making their packaging are not required to disclose it. So this is where consumer advocacy groups are trying to guide them, these food groups, to go back to their manufacturers and talk and figure out whether or not these are in their packaging, so that they can begin to make. To really let their customers know.
Right, exactly. It's interesting because a few months back, my granddaughters were visiting, and I don't use any packaged product, and I don't use any breads. So I did have them go with me to the supermarket and pick out. They wanted their English muffins and whatever they wanted for breakfast. It was interesting because after they left, I forgot they were in my refrigerator. They somehow got pushed to the back of the fridge. What amazed me was it had to be at least a month later, Brita, when I realized they were still in there, and I looked at them, and they looked as new as the day I bought it. And I looked at that, and I said, this can't be good, because I know back in the day you would have, enough mold to make a penicillin shot out of all over it. And I was like, wow, what are they putting this stuff that it never rots?
Right. We are, finding new ways to sort of create foods, with the sole purpose of these foods being able to sit on a shelf longer and longer and longer periods. We've seen this with genetically modified, fruits and vegetables. So we've got a giant tomato, or we've got these fruits and vegetables with no seeds, for instance, but that can last much longer, but they're completely tasteless and probably very nutritionally void, or at least so much more so than a local fresh variety. One of the sidebars to the piece has to do with scientists are working to develop actually nano coatings for fruit, like bananas, so that it can sit out longer. And you can see why this would be appealing to supermarkets, and to those who are trucking food across the globe. But again, we have so little information as consumers. I think that would be very frightening to people who are choosing to buy fresh foods, that this might be happening without their even knowing it, that there's no labeling required. So this is one of the reasons that this labeling is so important, not just because even people that are just avoiding the packaged food, that might not be enough someday. Someday we may begin to see these being used as coatings on even fruits and vegetables.
Well, here's my thought. I said, if it doesn't degrade in the refrigerator, how is it going to be absorbed in your body? How long is this stuff going to exist inside your body?
Right. We really do need to ask ourselves, what we are putting in our body. Is this something that, is this a smart choice? Is this a healthy choice? And I think we do need to look at our kind of packaged food intake in general, and to what degree we can. It is, just always advisable to kind of get back to those whole foods, to that whole food diet, is the healthiest. And again, it's not always easy to do. And I know I have children, so I know that that's a particularly difficult thing is to avoid the snacks. When they, that's the kind of stuff you give for school. It's just easy. But, I think, again, you try to find some balance and make the healthiest choices that you can. But a lot of these additives and preservatives are really problematic as well.
Well, yeah, it amazes me how long some things will last. All right, I have the other side of the coin. I find myself, I have to go to the supermarket at least 3 times a week to buy, fresh vegetables. And, I primarily shop the organic aisle. Luckily, we have one. But I do know a lot of people are considering growing their own food. And at the same time, a lot of Americans are being how could we say, ticketed or fined for having gardens around their home. So it's a crazy world that we're living in for sure.
I mean, yeah, I think that is a sad development if people are being prosecuted for gardens. But,
I know. And I always said, what's the point of a grass lawn? You can't eat it, can't smoke it. And then when you have people putting in beautiful vegetable gardens in their front lawn, they're getting arrested.
Right.
I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. But, maybe it does make sense if you figure out who's making the money on this. Now, you did talk about some of the health problems with this, and you did mention toothpaste, and people need to pay attention. There is a warning on every tube of toothpaste you buy that you're not supposed to ingest it, but yet a lot of little kids do. But you say that you could also be taking in nanoparticles through dental fillings and even getting dental implants.
Right. So, I mean, these are just, there's just so many pathways that these come into the body, and dental fillings is yet another pathway to the body. You get the silver fillings, and I know in many cases they've replaced the silver fillings, but for people that already have them, it's another place where you're absorbing these. And then once, they've kind of get into the body, they can just travel throughout the body. And there was one, the American Society of Safety Engineers had said, that has sort of this whole information about nanoparticles on their site, which was saying once it goes into the bloodstream, these nanoparticles, they can enter the digestive system, they can move throughout the body, they can accumulate in organs, and potentially cause damage. So, this is the American Society of Safety Engineers. I mean, just kind of information that's, publicly available on their website. So this is not, by any means, kind of hokey science. This is, a very legitimate concern. It's certainly of serious concern to people who are working in that kind of manufacturing with these particles and handling them, because they're so fine, and they're added to materials almost in like a powder form. So you can imagine it very easy to inhale, for instance.
Right.
Very easy for these to migrate. So they really try to get them into, a more cohesive form as quickly as possible. But for people handling them, I mean, certainly a worry. But I mean, also for those of us who are using these products, eating these products, I mean, we are being exposed to these on a regular basis as well, and we have very little information about it, and I think that's certainly cause for concern. Absolutely.
Now, the article talks about the Safe Chemicals Act. Does that cover nanotechnology?
Right now, it does not cover it specifically, but it's, a woman I spoke with at the Natural Resources Defense Council said, she felt that it covers it sort of inadvertently. Basically, there's a clause in the Safe Chemicals Act that says, if a substance being added, if a chemical substance is being used in a different than normal manner, it's determined to be kind of separate and distinct, then it should be required to be tested on its own. So it's thought that nanoparticles kind of fall under that umbrella of that they're different enough from their larger scale counterparts that they do create different reactions in the body that they would be considered as separate and require separate testing. Mm-hmm. But it's not specifically named. So, I mean, I think that's problematic. That being said, the Safe Chemicals Act is just, such an important piece of legislation and something that, I think listeners should really know about. The Toxic Substances Control Act that's currently guiding our chemical policy in this country was passed in the 1970s, and it's just incredibly outdated. They grandfathered in more than 60,000 chemicals which means they never have to be safety tested for their,
Wow.
any harm they might cause to human health or environmental health. And it's really just, it's so full of loopholes, and it's just allowed really for just to have no precaution when it comes to our chemicals in this country. And our understanding about chemicals and what they can do has changed so radically since then. So the Safe Chemicals Act would be an enormous step forward. It would basically force all chemicals to prove their safety before they would be allowed into the marketplace. And that includes existing ones, includes ones that have been grandfathered in.
Right, but that's not in effect yet, is it?
No, so this is a piece of legislation that comes up every single year, and just last year finally passed committee, which means it could come up for a vote this year in Congress, but there is just not a lot of political will to get this piece of legislation, really to give it a hearing. I mean, there's just a lot of interest against it, and it's a very uphill battle, but one that I think is gaining a lot of momentum among so many, consumer groups, health groups, environmental groups, anti-cancer societies. I mean, all these different organizations that have really rallied behind this legislation because it's really the only sensible kind of approach to chemicals.
Right. It seems like, remember Dow's, I think it was Dow back many years ago, used to have a commercial on TV, Better Living Through Chemicals. And now it seems like everything is chemically connected. I'd like to just read one paragraph out of the article, if that's okay, Brita.
Sure.
It says, science has already shown that nanoparticles, once ingested, can be taken up by the intestinal tract and, depending on their size, pass into the lymph nodes, affecting the immune system, or into the capillaries where they can settle in various organs. And for this reason, an article in the Journal of Nanobiotechnology in 2004 cautioned that for those nanoparticles designed to stabilize food or to deliver drug via intestinal uptake, other, more demanding rules exist and should be followed before marketing these compounds. And that was in their own journal.
Right. I mean, there's absolutely enough evidence already that these don't act the same way as their larger scale counterparts, as the FDA would sort of like us to believe. They clearly are able to go places that larger particles can't. They really kind of have free reign in the body. Once they're in the body, they can start to circulate in the bloodstream. They can accumulate in organs. They could potentially disrupt, immune function, as you mentioned. I mean, so, it's sort of the studies that are being done. They're kind of playing catch up at this point. But, each one of these particles, and one of the problems is one researcher told me, each one of these particles needs to be studied independently, and they have to look at its impacts on each, individual system of the body. I mean, it's a very tedious process to show the impacts of each nanoparticle on each bodily system. So, you can imagine the length of time it takes to do that kind of testing, and just the sheer volume of testing that needs to be done. So that's the stage we're at. But there's certainly enough red flags already that's saying these could cause potential harm. It's absolutely
Right.
positive. And what are we going to do about it now? They're already out there.
Right.
So it really comes back to food manufacturers taking the first step and really finding out what is in their product chain to begin with, to really know for themselves, and then to begin to make changes as they see fit. And at the very least, the public should really be calling for better labeling of these particles.
Absolutely. Well, look at how we got defeated in California by Monsanto's never-ending supply of money. I mean, we can't even get our products labeled, just to say if it's genetically modified or not. I mean, humans should have the choice to know whether they want to ingest that or not.
And that it really is a very similar type of issue, because the genetically modified foods, it's again, you have an agency, a federal agency saying, well, we think it's the same thing. We don't see any really identifiable difference. But again, there's health studies showing that there is a difference, and there's plenty of consumers that are concerned about the health impacts, and that would choose otherwise once given the choice. So it's really, I think it really comes back to, well, this is our choice. You know what I mean? This is what we're choosing to eat, and we want to be informed. And I think, so again, I don't think that the Prop 37 fight is going away. I think it's very much still alive. It is a shame that it was defeated, but I think that there's certainly a lot of public pressure and momentum around these issues, around getting a handle on our food supply and knowing what we're putting in our bodies, knowing where the food we eat comes from, what's in it. I mean, I feel like it's really been in recent years that people have begun really thinking a lot more critically about these issues. When before they would just kind of walk into the supermarket and grab something and go.
Right.
I think now there's a lot more consideration about, well, how far has this traveled, and what pesticides were used on it, and what do I know about this? So
exactly.
I think
just because the package looks pretty doesn't mean that what's inside is going to be good for you. Right.
I mean, even as you mentioned, the all natural, a lot of these terminologies that are being used on packaging that's kind of meant to mislead you. For consumers to really know which of these terms are regulated, which means something, and it's really kind of only a handful, that really mean anything, and I think that organic label is really a great starting place for people, because that is something that has some teeth behind it, and does mean something in terms of you're getting something that's, I mean, really reducing the chemical burden, the pesticide burden, both for your body and for the planet.
Well, I'd like to ask you, as a young mother, doesn't it make you even more concerned because you have young children?
I mean, absolutely. This has been, for me, the more I know, the more frightening it is. Again, I really find myself making those same types of decisions as everyone else, I think, which is, what's in my budget, where are my priorities here? And I really do, when it comes to food choices, I really try to make those decisions with, getting organic when possible. And certain things are more expensive than others, so you do have to sometimes make those choices. I have a 9-month-old, so for her in particular, I'm especially concerned, but it also comes down to some other things I think that are fairly easy to implement in terms of avoiding certain chemicals. Canned food is a great way to avoiding canned food is a great way to avoid bisphenol A or BPA, which leaches into a lot of our canned food. Mm-hmm. Trying to avoid storing food and certainly heating food in plastic is a good one. So really, I've tried to switch where possible, really, to like the glass containers for all my food.
Right.
And avoiding Teflon, where, that was, something you just saw everywhere. And now, we've learned so much more about Teflon and how that gets into the body. And so, it is challenging. And at the same time, I feel like there are a lot more options out there. There's a lot more information. We can order things online that we want, So, we're seeing everything now that's for babies and children that's bisphenol, BPA free. So I feel like it's kind of as scary as it is, it's a relief in a sense to be informed and to know kind of a little bit of the truth of what's out there and be able to make very conscious decisions.
I would think in a huge way it's very empowering for you because you have the knowledge, so you can skirt around a lot of the stuff other people are just taking for granted. And, it is time, I think it's past time, and maybe economically, too, is going to force people. It's time to learn how to cook again, people. Okay? It's time to learn how to eat at home without sticking something, prepackaged in your microwave. And, with a little baby like you have, I'm going to assume that you're considering making your own baby food.
Amazingly, she's already moved past baby food, but I also have a 6-year-old daughter as well, and I did a lot of that kind of, the homemade baby food. You do find that making kind of simple, there's a lot of simple things you can make at home. I'm a working mom. I get home late, so I know how tricky that can be, kind of balancing everything.
Right.
But yeah, one of the things that, honestly sounds silly, but I found to be so helpful has been even the making your own cleaners, which is not only extremely inexpensive, but really works fantastic, and you don't have to worry about spraying things around your children. So I use like the distilled white vinegar and water in a spray bottle, and I use it for almost everything. Like to me, it mirrors, glass, anything. And so things like that, it's just, to me, it was kind of a revelation for me to learn that. But here, you don't need all these chemical cleaners, which are really bad to be spraying around a baby or around young children. And then you have to worry about locking up the cabinets and all that. And here, your kid can clean with you. Here, take a spray bottle. It's just vinegar and water.
You just gave me a perfect segue to a show I'm doing this month on, I forget the author's name offhand, but she wrote a fabulous book called Eco Thrifty. how to save money by making your own products. Of course, vinegar and water was one of them she uses for cleaning. And also, be kind to the environment. And I think these are important things for people to relearn. We don't need all the flashy packaged garbage chemicals that we're using for, things. I remember when I was a young girl, Brita, my mom used to wash the windows with vinegar and water, and she would use newspaper, literal real newspapers to wipe them down, and they never had any streaks. Of course, as a little kid, I used to watch her and wonder, where's all that newsprint going? But, that's the way she did. She washed her windows with vinegar and water and newspapers. It was pre-paper towel days. Paper towels were something for the ultra rich when I was a kid.
Right. I mean, so much of green living, as we've certainly discovered at E-Magazine here, is really just kind of old-fashioned living. It's really just going back to the basics. And so many of the things that we think of as sort of this recent revelation, it's really just kind of practical knowledge that's been around forever, right. that we're just kind of coming back to now.
Absolutely.
We're rediscovering.
So it's like everything old is new again. I think about that. Sometimes people call me, they're not feeling well. And I'll tell them the same home remedies my grandmother used, 50 years ago. And they're cheap, inexpensive, actually remedies that actually work. Instead of right away running to the grocery store, getting, again, the latest package, miracle cure in a box that's going to cost you at least $20 when you can do the same thing for $1. So, some people say that I'm frugal, but, why not save money and save the environment at the same time, and your health? Let's not leave that out.
Right. And I mean, as you mentioned, to not be sort of swayed by packaging, and I think people are getting a lot more savvy about that. But, this nanoparticles and so many of the things that we're seeing, that packaged food, really, there's just not a lot going for it at this point. There's so many reasons to avoid it. So where possible, this is just something for consumers to kind of keep in mind when you're shopping. If there are, fresh food alternatives, as you said, what you can make at home, there's just, I think there's so many kind of fun ways to explore it online and to find to look up recipes, whether it's for cleaners or for foods. There's even ways that people can use
right.
apps to make meals based on what's in the refrigerator now. There's just there's so many creative ways, around it, that I think people should really look at it as kind of a fun assignment, kind of a fun challenge. How can I avoid these? What can I do instead?
Exactly. Plus, one of the benefits I find is when you cook at home, you keep your weight down. Even if you go out and make good choices, there's still a lot of salt and fat used in restaurant food. And whenever I notice I'm up 2 pounds, I say, that's it, I'm eating home the rest of the week. So it's a good little way of challenging yourself and keeping yourself healthy and lean.
Absolutely, right. And really allows you to sort of control, to really control what's in your diet. Because when you eat out, you never know. You just,
right.
there's always, the hidden ingredients that make things taste a little better, but for the moment. So, absolutely, getting a greater control of our food supply, greater knowledge of what we're eating, and really demanding more transparency and better labeling.
Absolutely.
Moving forward.
Absolutely. Well, Brita, thanks so much for joining me, and your baby is very lucky to have you for its mom.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Take good care now. Brita Belli, she is the editor of E-Magazine. E-Magazine is amazing, and I highly recommend it. So I know it might sound like, that's going to be a whole lot of work, but think about getting back to home cooking and actually knowing what's in your food, because, man, it's like every day they come up with some new poison to slip inside our food. Anyway, thanks for listening. I'll be back tomorrow with the news.
Thank you for listening and supporting The Meria Show. Tell others what you learned today. Knowledge becomes wisdom only when it's shared. Encourage others to subscribe today. www.meria.net. Often imitated, never duplicated. A world of information all in one place. www.meria.net. Always ahead of the curve. Always on your side. Get active or get radioactive. Subscribe today.